want to discuss an issue today that I think gets much too little attention from the corporate media and from members of Congress. As I think many of you remember, when Donald Trump ran for president and since, he told the American people that he is a friend of workers. He told them that he was going to take on the establishment and the elite and support the needs of average Americans. Well, I know that I will not be shocking many of you when I suggest that Donald Trump lied. Now, I'm not just talking about the total contempt that he has shown for some 800,000 federal workers who are not receiving paychecks because of his shutdown of the federal government. As you know, many of these workers live paycheck to paycheck, and an increasing number of them are deeply worried about how they're going to be able to pay their mortgages, how they're going to put food on the table, how they'll be able to pay for the doctor's visit when their kids get sick. In terms of federal workers, Trump's contempt for them goes even beyond this horrific shutdown. Not too long ago, Trump announced that he would be freezing the pay of federal employees. Inflation continues to go up. Federal employees get no wage increase, which means they are actually losing ground economically. But Trump's disdain for American workers goes well beyond the federal workforce. When you attempt, as Trump did, to throw 32 million Americans off of the health care they have, trust me, you are not a friend of workers. When you propose a budget, as Trump did last year, which makes $1 trillion cut to Medicaid, a $500 billion cut to Medicare, and a $72 billion cut to the Social Security Disability Fund, which would create massive suffering for millions of ordinary Americans, you are not a friend of working people in this country. Trump likes to claim that there are union workers who support them. Maybe some of them do. But these union workers should understand that Trump's appointees to the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, are extremely anti-union and anti-worker. President Trump rescinded President Obama's overtime rule and denied time and a half pay to millions of workers who otherwise would be receiving that pay. When you take away overtime pay from struggling workers, trust me, you are not a friend of the American middle class. At a time when the minimum wage is a starvation wage of $7.25 an hour, you are not a friend of American workers when you appoint a chief economist, Larry Kudlow, who calls the minimum wage silly and a terrible idea. Now, here is the most important point that I want to make. Donald Trump tells us that the U.S. economy is absolutely booming, the strongest we've ever had, and the greatest in the history of America. Yes, at his Mar-a-Lago Country Club, where the price of admission has doubled to $200,000 a year, he is right. For those folks who can afford the $200,000 membership fee, and for the top 1% and much of corporate America, the truth is that the economy is really doing very well. But for the middle class and working families of our country, the struggle continues for them as to how to put food on the table, how to pay for housing and prescription drugs, how to put a few bucks aside for their children's college education. Let me briefly describe what is going on in our economy today. In 2017, the top 10 corporate executives saw their combined compensation skyrocket by over 60% from the year before, soaring to $1.85 billion. That means, on average, these individuals each received $185 million in compensation. Yep, that's true. For those people, the economy is doing really, really well. Further, the top 25 hedge fund managers on Wall Street made over $15.3 billion in compensation in 2017, up 40% from 2016, the highest in 4 years. That means, on average, each of them received $612 million in compensation. Incredibly, I want you to hear this, because this talks about priorities in America. This $15.3 billion is nearly double what all 140,000 kindergarten teachers in America made last year. Got that? 25 hedge fund managers made nearly double what all of the kindergarten teachers in America made last year. You will not be surprised to note that since Trump was elected, the 5 wealthiest people in America have seen their wealth go up by over $100 billion, and corporations have announced over $1 trillion in stock buybacks in 2018 alone. Now, that's what's going on for the very, very rich. They're doing just great. But meanwhile, over the past year, real wages for average workers in this country are up by all of 1.2%, just $9.11 a week after adjusting for inflation. While the very rich get much richer, millions of Americans are working longer hours for lower wages. They're working 2 jobs, they're working 3 jobs in order to provide for their families. That is the economic reality today under Donald Trump, and that is the economic reality in this country over the past 40 years. The truth is that the United States today has more income and wealth inequality than at any time since the 1920s. Since the Wall Street crash of 2008, 46% of all new income has gone to the top 1%. Corporate CEOs have seen their incomes go up by 937% over the past 40 years and now make 360 times more than their average employees. While corporate profits are near an all-time high, wages as a percentage of the economy are near an all-time low. The most important economic reality of our time, and an issue that very few people talk about, is that over the past 40 years, there has been an enormous transfer of wealth and income from the middle class to the people on top. Since 1979, the bottom 90% of Americans have seen their share of national income decline from 58% to just 46%, costing them nearly $11,000 per household. As bad as income inequality is, the inequality in wealth is even worse. And I want you to hear this, because you're not going to hear too many people talking about it, certainly not on TV, not in the halls of Congress. In America today, the top 0.1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. The 3 wealthiest people in this country own more wealth than the bottom half of Americans, 160 million people. Meanwhile, the median household income in America has less wealth today than it did 35 years ago after adjusting for inflation. And the average wealth of those in the bottom 40% is virtually zero. They got nothing in the bank. They have no wealth at all. Bottom 40% of the American people. While low-income workers at Walmart are forced to rely on food stamps, Medicaid, and public housing to survive, the owners of Walmart, the Walton family, are now worth nearly $170 billion. And shockingly, the wealth gap between white Americans and African Americans has more than tripled over the past 50 years. That gap is growing wider and wider. Now, you want to know why people in our country are angry and why they are frustrated? You want to know why so many people are falling victim to diseases of despair like opioid addiction, alcoholism, and suicide? Well, it has a lot to do with the fact that the average worker makes less today than he or she did 43 years ago after adjusting for inflation. In other words, as the price of health care and prescription drugs, housing, child care, and college education continues to go up, wages for the average American worker have not kept pace, and many, in fact, are falling further and further behind. So we say, no, Donald Trump. The economy is not absolutely booming when nearly 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. And that means these workers pray and hope that they don't get sick or that their car doesn't break down. Because if that happens, they're in a financial disastrous situation. No, Donald Trump, it is not the greatest economy in the history of America when 43% of households cannot afford to pay for housing, food, childcare, healthcare, transportation, and a cell phone without going into debt. No, Donald Trump, the economy is not booming when Americans are reaching retirement age in worse financial shape than their parents, and when about half of older Americans have no retirement savings at all. And they have no idea how they will be able to retire in dignity. Imagine reaching the age of 65, nothing in the bank, trying to survive on Social Security. No, Donald Trump, it is not the strongest economy we've ever had when hundreds of thousands of young people are unable to go to college because of the high cost of higher education, when over 30 million Americans have no health insurance, when 1 out of 5 Americans can't afford the medicine prescribed by their doctors, and when over 40 million people in our country are living in poverty. This is not an economy we should be proud of when we have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the developed world. And life expectancy in the United States has gone down for the 3rd year in a row. No, that is not an economy that is booming or that we should be proud of. Now, if we are to create an economy that works for all of us and not just the few, we need to change our national priorities in a very, very bold way. And here are just a few of the things that we have to do. Instead of giving huge tax breaks to billionaires and large corporations, we must demand that they start paying their fair share of taxes. Instead of an austerity program for working families and the poor, we need austerity for billionaires and large multinational corporations. Instead of throwing millions of Americans off of the health care that they have, we must join every other major country on earth and guarantee health care as a right, not a privilege, through a Medicare for all health care program. Instead of cutting Social Security and nutrition assistance for senior citizens, we should expand those programs so that every American can retire with dignity and respect. Instead of gutting the Social Security net, we should raise the minimum wage to a living wage of $15 an hour. Instead of cutting Pell Grants and increasing interest rates on student loans, we should make public colleges and universities tuition-free and substantially lower the outrageous level of student debt in this country. Instead of privatizing our infrastructure, we should rebuild our crumbling roads and bridges, transit and rail, water systems, and electric grid, and create up to 15 million good-paying jobs in the process. Together, we must fight for a society and a government that works for the many, that works for all of us, and not just for the few and wealthy campaign contributors. Together, we must fight for economic, social, racial, and environmental justice, not unbridled greed. Together, we can transform this country. Let us stand up, let us fight back, let us do it. Thank you very much.